So, plunging fire. What is it? Is it dangerous? If it is, how dangerous is it? And what can you do to prevent it? And why is it a thing in the first place? Well, plunging fire was a growing concern for various navies in the 1910s, particularly the latter part of the 1910s. And it would go on to dominate quite a lot of naval thinking during the interwar period, and you'd see the knock-on effects of that in various battleship design changes, both for new-build ships and for refits of existing ships. So, what exactly do we define as plunging fire? Well, simply put, if a shell is fired from a battleship at another target, presumably in this case another battleship, then that shell is going to go up into the sky at a given angle, which is going to be initially defined by how high you're elevating that gun, which is also obviously going to have an effect on how far that shell goes. And then as it comes back down again, it's going to hit the target, hopefully, at an angle that is related to the angle it was fired at, but is not the same, because of course it's losing energy as it goes. And when you consider a ship as an armoured box, at least for capital ships, that shell could either hit the side of the box or the top of the box, so the belt armour or the deck armour. Now in the 1900s, the early 1910s, and well, for the 19th century that preceded that, the hit the top part wasn't really a huge concern, because accurate gunfire, and indeed the range of guns, was somewhat limited right up until the invention of the rangefinder, and even once the rangefinder was invented, things like the maximum elevation of guns and the limitations on rangefinders and fire control computers still meant that the overall distance that a shell could travel and reliably hit a target was not that great compared to what we'd think of in, let's say, the Second World War. And this meant two things. Firstly, statistically speaking, if you did hit the target, you were far more likely to hit the side of the target than the top of the target in terms of that armoured box that conceals the vitals of a capital ship. And secondly, even if you did hit that deck, you'd be coming in at such a shallow angle that the shell is fairly likely to detonate somewhere high up in the ship. Now, that's obviously not good for anybody who's nearby, but in terms of the vitals, the boiler room, the engines, the magazines, they're all fairly low in the ship. So if you have skipped up over the armour belt, well, you're not going to be detonating anywhere near them, and therefore a relatively thin amount of deck armour to catch fragments and blast would be sufficient to protect you. Additionally, even if the shell, let's say, punched through the belt armour in a World War I design, then a relatively thin amount of deck armour would be able to deflect or reject that shell because of the very shallow angles involved. And that brings us on to our first bit of geometry, because you see, it's all about angles. As you can see from this relatively crude image, if we have a shell that's coming down onto a slab of steel, which is represented by our lovely grey block, then if it's coming down vertically, i.e. perpendicular at 90 degrees, represented by the red line, then it has to travel through a given amount of material which directly corresponds to the thickness of said material. So if this material was, say, 1 inch thick, it has to travel through 1 inch of metal to get through to the other side. However, as you can see with the yellow, green and blue lines, the shallower and shallower that angle of impact becomes, to exit from out the same point, the distance through the metal becomes greater and greater, and so this is known as what's called apparent thickness. So the metal itself might only be, in this case, 1 inch thick from side to side, top to bottom, but in the case of, say, this blue line, which is coming in at about a 60-degree angle from perpendicular or a 30-degree angle relative to the plane of this block of steel, which would be the level of the deck, it has to travel through about twice the thickness of metal to get through to the same point. So a relatively thin piece of deck armour can have the effect, with very shallow angles of strike, of a much, much thicker piece of armour that was resisting a more direct perpendicular impact. At a range of around 10,000 yards or so, which would be considered the upper end of battle ranges in the late 1900s and very early 1910s, the multiplying factor you'd get would be almost 10 times. So a 1-inch thick piece of steel would have an apparent thickness of 9.5 to 9.75 inches, which, when you also take into account the fact that the shell would naturally being deflected away from the plate by that very, very shallow angle of impact, would be fairly close to enough to actually stop the shell. So a 1.5-inch thick deck or a 2-inch thick deck would have more than enough apparent thickness to deflect any arbitrary incoming shell in the early 1910s. Now, of course, there are limits to this principle. No sheet of metal is a perfectly rigid body. There would be some deflection and bending involved when a heavy object weighing hundreds or even low thousands of pounds slams into it at whatever angle. And so there would be a minimum thickness needed to physically deflect a shell of a given weight and caliber, regardless of what the apparent thickness might actually be. Think of it like perhaps firing a steel BB at a very shallow angle against a tension sheet of tinfoil. Now, theoretically, the depth of the tinfoil that the BB has to tear through at a very, very shallow angle might be several inches, and firing a BB into anything between 2 and 6 inches of solid metal, even if it is tin or aluminium, well, it's not really going to do much, is it? But because of the very, very thin nature of the foil, it still fails under the stresses imposed on it and then gets rucked up and torn and pushed away. And a similar thing could happen to shells if you, say, put 1/2 inch to 1 inch of armor plate down and said, oh, no, that will be fine. It won't be. But a little bit more thickness to it and you're okay. Now, the other factor involved at this stage of proceedings is simply the fact that at 10,000 yards, you're talking about a shell that's probably coming in at an angle of 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8 degrees. And if we take a look at this rather wonderful side profile of the King George V, which I'm using largely because I happen to have a pretty clear scan of it, and then we mirror it, so we have the full width of the ship adjacent to one of the magazines, and we put, as you can see, the waterline in, you can see roughly how much of the ship total, in terms of the hull and particularly in terms of the armoured section, is available for impact by shells above the waterline. And for below the waterline, we're going to take the point at which the belt starts to thin out as our maximum depth, which, to be fair, at closer ranges is probably reasonably realistic. Now, we're going to put a few lines on here. You can see the red lines. Now, the red lines indicate the fall of a shell coming in at 6 degrees. So a typical shell coming in at a range of about 10,000 yards. And you can see we've chosen our upper boundary there as not all the way across the ship's deck, but far enough across that a shell that penetrates the deck further beyond that is basically only going to blow up random non-vital compartments, possibly splash off the internal side of the armour on the far side of the ship. So it's not going to do critical damage, whereas a shell that is penetrating the armour, in the case of this picture, to the right of that upper line, at least has a chance of fragments going down into, in this case, the magazine area. Even if the shell itself, as you can probably work out, doesn't. Now, at our 10,000 yard range, which, as we said, is denoted by the red lines with a 6-degree angle of fall, you can see if you look up the ship's side that the vast majority of shells in that path of flight which will result in a meaningful hit are going to hit the belt, and relatively few are going to hit the deck. And as we said, if they do, you don't need all that much armour to stop them. However, you'll also notice there's a set of green lines. And these green lines are predicated on the angle of fall of a shell coming in at 20,000 yards, which is a range of engagement that was beginning to be reached by the end of World War I, and certainly that and beyond that was very much in the minds of people going into the interwar period. Now you can see here we're still using our same arbitrary points, but you can probably tell by mentally superimposing one of the green lines that now plunging fire that penetrates the deck, particularly on towards the starboard side in our diagram, actually stands a chance of getting pretty close to the magazines, and if this was machinery spaces, definitely into the machinery spaces, directly if it punches through the deck. And you can also tell, again, if you draw an imaginary line in your head between the two green lines, that slightly more than half of shells coming down at this angle of descent are going to impact the deck, compared to the relatively small minority when we take into account the 10,000 yard bracket denoted by the red lines. So now, all of a sudden, by the end of the First World War and going into the interwar period, it's not only more likely that plunging shells can get much deeper into the ship towards the vitals, but it's statistically far more likely at these kind of engagement ranges that you are going to have a deck hit. Slightly more statistically likely than you are to get a belt hit. Now, both of these sets of angle of fall have been calculated using a 15-inch 42 caliber gun firing a late period shell, but even if we go with a relatively shallow angle weapon, say Bismarck's 15-inch guns, doesn't fundamentally alter much of anything at 10,000 yards, but at 20,000 yards you can see the angle of fall is a little bit shallower because it's coming in that little bit faster. And again, if you mentally draw a line between the two yellow lines in this case, you can see it's about 50-50 whether you'd score a deck or a belt hit. So now all of a sudden, plunging fire is a problem at what you might consider to be basic battle ranges, and when people are thinking about engaging at 25,000, 30,000 yards, potentially further, plunging fire becomes a greater and greater proportion of the number of hits you score, at least in theory. But also, as the angle of fall increases, the effective thickness of the deck armor decreases. So, for example, when we looked at a 6-degree angle of fall, we said it was almost a 10 times multiplier. Well, at a 20-degree angle of fall, so that would be in the low 20s of thousands of yards for most guns, your effective multiplier has reduced from almost 10 times to just under 3 times. So your 1.5 or 2-inch thick deck, let's say 2 inches, is now equivalent to a little bit under 6 inches. 6 inches of steel ain't going to stop a 15-inch shell. Now, of course, the King George V is only one design, as you can see from this selection of interwar fast battleships. Different ships had their main armour belts protruding different amounts above the waterline, and therefore their main armour decks were also at somewhat different heights. So the lower the main armour deck is, and obviously the less exposed the belt is, then, well, there's more superstructure or in the hull, i.e. unarmoured portions of the hull, for the shell to just randomly blow up. But in terms of the protected area, obviously that means statistically an even greater number of shells are probably going to hit the deck rather than the belt, and thus plunging fire becomes even more of a concern. But in any case, as the interwar period goes on, not only are you facing the prospect of longer range engagements, and therefore, as we said, shells dropping in at a steeper angle, and shells being more likely to hit your deck armour than your belt armour, but the guns themselves and the shells are becoming more and more powerful, and therefore they have more absolute penetration. Now, this does lead to something of a problem, because as you can see here from our mirrored full-width King George V, if you look at just how much length there is going from port to starboard for the deck armour, compared to the depth, or the height, if you like, of the belt armour, there's far more deck armour in length in a cross-section, and therefore in surface area in overall ship design terms, than there is belt armour, which means that for a given thickness of deck armour, you're actually imposing a much greater weight penalty on the ship. So, for example, if your belt is, let's say, 20 feet tall, that would be quite unusually tall for a ship's belt, but, let's go with it. And your ship is 100 feet wide, well, you have two sets of belt armour, one on either side, so that's a total of 40 feet in height, but 100 feet in width for the deck. So that means that for every inch that you put on your belt, if you want to put a similar inch of armour on your deck, you have to pay 2.5 times the weight. Because, well, you're covering 2.5 times the area. And that's before you get stability calculations involved, because of course that weight is somewhat higher up than the majority of your belt armour is. So the solution isn't just, oh, well, I guess we're going to make our deck as thick as your belt, because you're going to basically end up with a floating brick. And who knows, it might not even float at that point. But you still do have that multiplier. Yes, it's massively reduced compared to pre-World War I ranges, but it is still there. So you can get away with a deck that is considerably thinner still than your belt, albeit not quite as much proportionally as it used to be. And you can see here that the King George V's used 5 inches of armour over their machinery and 6 inches over their magazines. And yeah, there's an inch higher up, but for the purposes of this discussion, we're simplifying it down to just that deck armour. Now, does putting, let's say, over the machinery 5 inches of armour actually help? Well, yes, it did, and in some very interesting ways, which actually shows up quite a lot of the interplay between the weight of an incoming shell and its angle of fall, and therefore also related to its muzzle velocity. Because let's examine how that 5 inches of deck armour would perform against various well-known shell and gun combinations from various ships of its period. Now, these figures are taken from the Nathan Oken Tables of Armour Penetration, which are available on the NAV website. They've all been calculated using the US Navy's empirical formula for armour penetration, and it should be noted that these are figures for penetration of the deck. Now, of course, even before that, so at a shorter range, you may still end up with spalling and fragments from a partial penetration or from a detonation above the deck that still spalls, so you may end up with some damage, but in terms of absolute protection, i.e. have you prevented the enemy shell from physically getting down into the depths of the ship, these are the figures. Against 15-inch 42 caliber guns, so British guns, firing the latest and greatest in World War II era shells, they would achieve deck penetration at about 29,000 yards, with an angle of fall of about 31 degrees. Now, that's not too bad, considering that obviously that is the thinner of the two sets of deck plating on the King George V, and it means that, well, inside of that, at least against full penetration, you are in theory quite safe, and very few, if any, battleship engagements took place even close to 29,000 yards, let alone beyond it. Now, what about the big guns, the 18.1-inch guns as found on Yamato and Musashi? Surely they're going to perform a lot better? No, actually. Bizarrely enough, they also have a penetration distance against 5-inch deck armour, at least on British ships, of 29,000 yards. Well, how can this be? It's a much, much bigger, much heavier shell. It is. However, it's striking at an angle of 25 degrees instead of 31 degrees. And remember what I said about that multiplier? Well, at 31 degrees, that apparent thickness multiplier is only 1.94, which gives that 5-inch deck armour an apparent thickness of 9.7 inches. But at 25 degrees, that multiplier is 2.37, giving an apparent thickness of almost 11.9 inches. So even though, yes, the 18.1-inch shell is by pretty much every metric a far superior shell for punching through armour compared to the 15-incher powered by normal charges but with a World War II era shell, that 6-degree difference in the angle of fall with the Japanese shell coming in at a shallower angle is adding around 20% to the apparent thickness of the deck armour, which is essentially wiping out all the penetration advantage of the Japanese shell and meaning that it's penetrating at about the same range. Okay, well, what about the Americans? The 16-inch 50 caliber gun, for example. Again, big heavy shell, not quite as heavy as the Yamatos, but still much heftier than the 15-inch 42. And yeah, it's penetrating at 29,000 yards as well. I swear I didn't plan this. Its incident angle, by the way, is 27 degrees, so it's coming in at a slightly steeper angle than the Japanese shell, but still a significantly shallower angle than the British shell, and it just so happens that that means that, well, again, the combination of incident angle and apparent thickness is cancelling out the superior penetration qualities of the 16-inch 50 shell compared to the 15-inch, so again, the King George V is vulnerable against that gun at 29,000 yards. But what about the 16-inch 45 caliber gun? It fires exactly the same Mark 8 shell, but it's found on the North Carolina and South Dakota classes. In this particular case, Indiana is our model. Now, this, obviously being a slightly shorter barrel weapon, fires the shell at a slightly slower pace, and therefore over distance its angle of fall is going to increase somewhat quicker than the shell fired from the Iowa's 16-inch 50s. And indeed, that actually means that, believe it or not, a North Carolina or a South Dakota has a better chance of penetrating King George V's deck at reasonable battle ranges than any of the other ships or guns we've just mentioned, because the 16-inch 45 can penetrate at just 26,000 yards, a full 3,000 yards closer, with an angle of fall of just over 27.5 degrees. You might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, if it's exactly the same shell, shouldn't it be coming in at exactly the same angle to get a given amount of penetration? Well, you've got to remember, again, it's coming in slower, so not only is obviously it coming in at a steeper angle at closer range, but it's also coming in physically slightly slower. So it just needs that extra just over half a degree more to ensure penetration, but it's a 3,000 yard margin of advantage, as we said, over all the other guns, and that pretty much in a nutshell encapsulates why the Iowa class had specific charges set aside for long-range fighting that would allow, if the captain thought necessary, for the 16-inch 50 guns to emulate the ballistic performance of the 16-inch 45 guns, because they were actually better for deck penetration at long ranges than the 16-inch 50s were, assuming the 16-inch 50s are using their full charges. Of course, at closer ranges for smashing through belt armor, you still use your full charge, but there you go. So that's the Americans and the Japanese out the way, but what about the other European powers? Well, Germany, Italy, and France all went with varying flavours of 15-inch guns, so let's start with the Germans first. Bismarck's guns, notoriously very high-velocity weapons, long barrel as well, and it turns out that actually for deck penetration, obviously this is not taking into account belt penetration or turret face penetration, all the other stuff they might accomplish, but for deck penetration, it turns out that this isn't actually the best of plans, because the 15-inch gun as found on the Bismarck class can only penetrate the 5-inch armour of the King George V's machinery spaces at 33,500 yards, with an angle of fall of 33 degrees. Now, that is, of course, the steepest angle of descent we've come across so far, but that's perhaps not surprising, considering that we're 4,500 yards beyond the furthest distance for any of the previous guns. And of course, it's also indicative of things like the shell weight in question being somewhat lighter than the Mark 8 Super Heavy or the 18.1 inch for that matter. Well, what about the Italians? Well, unfortunately for the Italians, although you definitely don't want to meet one of their 15-inch shells coming your way if it's striking your belt at reasonable battle ranges, assuming, of course, they actually hit you. If it hits your deck armour, at least if you're in a King George V, you may be quids in, because for the Italian 15-inch gun, it needs to get out to a range of 34,000 yards, another 500 yards past even Bismarck, in order to get through that 5 inches of deck armour, with an angle of fall of 29.2 degrees. Obviously, that's shallower than Bismarck's, but reflecting differences again in shell design, shell weight, and the fact the Italian shell is probably still moving at warp factor 6 when it hits you. And that, of course, leaves us with the French, the 15-inch guns found on the Richelieu class, and they're kind of at an intermediate stage. They can penetrate the 5-inch armour at 32,000 yards, so somewhat closer than their 15-inch German and Italian compatriots, but still 3,000 yards beyond the 18.1 inch or the 16-inch 50, or indeed the British 15-inch, and their angle of fall at 32,000 yards is 31.6 degrees. So a very close angle of fall to the British 15-inch gun, but because of the higher velocity of the French gun, it's extending that penetration window out to about 32,000 yards and beyond. So, all things considered, if you want to punch through heavy deck plating in a late interwar or World War II era battleship engagement, of all the various modern or modern-ish guns that you can think of, the 16-inch 45 or a 16-inch 50 simulating a 16-inch 45 is probably actually your best bet. Now, you might be thinking, okay, I understand there's a weight penalty, but given that 5 inches of armor can do this, why not slap an extra half inch or inch of armor on and extend that margin of protection out even further beyond any kind of reasonable engagement distance? Well, bear in mind that the magazines did have that extra inch of armor at 6 inches, and you know, the magazines are somewhat more likely to be critical to your continued existence than a portion of your machinery, vital though the machinery is. But the other thing is cost benefit. Bearing in mind that if you take, for example, again, the Iowa class, in late World War II exercises, it was calculated that even with all their radar and fire control system advantages, at 30,000 yards, which bear in mind is only 1,000 yards beyond what the 16-inch 50s firing their regular charges would actually be able to penetrate the deck armor at, and that's the 5-inch deck armor, not the 6, they're only anticipating about a 2.7% hit ratio, assuming that the target was, charming enough to go broadside onto them. If the target was maneuvering in any way, that was going to drop, and of course that was in exercises. Real-life battle practice is usually far worse than that for accuracy. So let's say, for sake of argument, there's a 1.5% chance to actually hit a broadside target in realistic conditions at 30,000 yards. Well, with 9 guns on the ship, that's somewhere around 7 to 8 salvos to get just one hit. And that hit might not be on the deck, it might be on the belt. Even if it is on the deck, it might not be over a vital space. It could be into the superstructure, it could be into the bow or the stern, or wherever else. And that's being generous with 1.5%. If we take it down to 1%, for example, then you need over 10 full salvos just to get a single hit. And so when you're designing to deal with plunging fire, it's not just about can we extend our immunity zone far enough away that it becomes arbitrarily practically impossible to score such a hit. It's also a case of, well, can we save weight by making it extremely unlikely and then dedicating that saved weight to other things like, I don't know, engines, which might let us cross that danger zone relatively quickly. And then once we get inside that range, not only does our own accuracy go up, obviously the enemies will as well, but then our deck armor is functionally immune to plunging fire. And of course, exactly how much emphasis you put onto immunity from plunging fire and the various risk factors involved is very much going to be determined by at what distance are you planning to engage the enemy at. If you genuinely believe that you're going to be fighting your enemy at 25, 28, 30,000 yards for extended periods of time, then yeah, it's probably worth investing a bit more in your deck armor. However, if you're thinking that, yeah, we'll probably start firing at that range, but we're going to close the range down and get to low 20s or even into the tens of thousands of yards for our main fight, then, well, you can probably afford to maybe save an inch or two on your deck armor and put that weight into making your belt armor considerably thicker, because now, so all of a sudden, that's the thing that's more likely to take the hits, and as we established, you do need considerably thicker belt armor than you do deck armor to resist incoming shell fire. So, there you go. That's a very quick précis into what plunging fire is, why it's dangerous, how to protect against it, why deck armor is thinner but exerts more of a weight penalty on ships, and how, using a case study, ships in the interwar period, and to be honest into the early World War II period, were designed to try and cope with plunging fire, both in terms of how much deck armor they put in and what kind of tactics and strategy they adopted. So I hope that's been useful, and if you have any further questions about plunging fire or related topics, obviously let us know in the comments below. Look forward to reading the questions, but thanks very much for listening for now. Bye.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.